everyone. Hope everyone is doing well today. We're just going to wait a little bit to let some more attendees trickle in. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to celebrate the holiday with all of us. Really excited to be hosting this event in collaboration with Mr. Psychedelic Law. And I hope you guys are excited to learn more about what we have going on throughout Florida. Some awesome speakers will be talking today and presenting today about really cool stuff surrounding psilocybin and psychedelic therapy. So really excited to bring you this presentation. Okay, great. Yeah, so in the chat, if you'd like to go ahead and just introduce yourself to the rest of the group, the panelists, feel free to drop in, your name, where you're located, whether it be in Florida, which city, what state, country. We'd like to have this session be as interactive as possible. Awesome. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Just give me one sec. Let me share my screen. Great. Okay, so I'll be speaking to you guys today about what psilocybin is. It's a brief history of this compound, an overview of it. My name is Dr. Saad Al-Olimat. I hold my Doctor of Pharmacy degree from Duquesne University over in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I am the co-founder of PsiloHealth. PsiloHealth is a collective of healthcare professionals, advocates, entrepreneurs, and we are geared toward providing surrounding psilocybin for mental health. A brief disclaimer for today's event is that this presentation and the information throughout today's event is designed for educational purposes only. Psilocybin and other substances that we speak about may largely be illegal. We do not condone the illegal use of any substances. This is not medical advice, and this is not legal advice. So, very briefly, I'd like to go what psilocybin is. So the mechanism of action of this compound is that it is a serotonin 2A receptor agonist. So it binds to this specific receptor subtype, and it creates the serotonergic-like effects. So that's typical traditional antidepressants usually tackle the serotonin area. So for example, like fluoxetine is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Going back to psilocybin, the time to peak is around an hour to 90 minutes or so. And the half-life of psilocin, the active compound, once psilocybin is metabolized, is 160 minutes. This chart right here on the slide depicts psilocybin, and like its dosing schema. So with dried fruiting body psilocybin mushrooms, for example, a high dose is classified as over 4 grams, a medium dose is roughly 2 to 3 grams, and a microdose is listed as 0.1 to 0.5 grams. And here at the bottom of the slide, we see serotonin, the neurotransmitter, and we look at its chemistry, and it's very closely related to psilocybin and psilocin, being that it's a tryptamine analog. Psilocybin, as I mentioned, gets metabolized to psilocin. So people usually mention psilocybin as the active component of magic mushrooms. It's actually not necessarily correct, because psilocybin is not psychoactive until it is metabolized to psilocin, seen on the right-hand side over here. Moving on to the timeline. So it's really important to understand where we stand, where we're at today, 2020, where we stand in relation to the vast history of the ceremonial use of these mushrooms and psilocybin research. This timeline is by no means comprehensive. I really encourage everyone here to check out psychedelictimes.com for a great outline and timeline that highlights a lot of great events throughout the psychedelic renaissance. Additionally, I really encourage everyone on this attendee list right now, panelists included, to please go ahead and write in an event or an article, a book, or a notable psychonaut that they'd recommend others to look into. So let's go into starting around 5000 BCE. We have mushroom-holding bee shaman paintings depicted in the caves of southeastern Algeria. We fast forward to 1500 BCE, and we observe mushroom stones in Guatemala and very similar statues in Mexico as well. These statues highlight the religious and ceremonial use of these fungi. Understand that these compounds are native and close to many indigenous cultures. Under the context of spiritual healing, it would be a disservice to not mention Maria Sabina. She was a Mazatec curandera, or shaman. Her sacred mushroom ceremonies are known for introducing the Western world to the potentials of entheogenic mushrooms. Once that potential caught mainstream attention, Dr. Albert Hofmann, he synthesized psilocybin in 1959 and then published his synthesis of psilocybin in 1959. So 1958 was when he synthesized it, 1959 was when he published the synthesis of it. A year later, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals began producing psilocybin tablets and marketed psilocybin under the brand name of Indocybin. This entire decade was ripe with psychedelic research and psilocybin-centric literature. With that being said, I really recommend you all to check out the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Its key contributors, Timothy Leary, for example. This decade there's a lot of amazing and notable events happened throughout it. Unfortunately, we couldn't capture all of that with this timeline. But one thing we think that is very important to note is that in 1970, specifically October 27th, Richard Nixon signed into law the Controlled Substances Act. This lumped psilocybin and psilocin, among other psychedelics, into the Schedule I list of drugs. I'll get into what a Schedule I compound exactly means. However, what is important to note is that this act and the stigma surrounding the political and countercultural utility of psychedelic compounds halted a lot of the prolific research going on throughout the late 50s and 60s. 1986, Rick Doblin founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. This is also commonly known as MAPS. MAPS's mission is to develop the medical, legal, and cultural context for people to benefit from the careful uses of psychedelics. Hugely important. Fast forward to 1999, you have Dr. Roland Griffiths of Johns Hopkins University. He began investigating the effects of psilocybin on mystical type experiences, psychological distress, and tobacco cessation. In 2009, Dr. Robin Carhart Harris founded the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial College in London. The center now focuses on the action and clinical use of psychedelics, with a particular focus on researching the treatment of depression. In 2016, the first graduate school to provide training and certification in psychedelic-assisted therapy and research was established. This school is the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. More recently, in 2018, the very well-known book, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, was published. This book has been hugely great for normalizing and bringing healthy conversation to many surrounding the healing potential of psychedelic therapy. If you have not read this book and you have not much background or understanding as to what's going on within this renaissance, I, again, hugely recommend everyone to check out this book. In 2019, this was a great year for psychedelic reform and research. On May 9th, for example, Denver, Colorado became the first city in the US to decriminalize the cultivation, possession, and use of psilocybin mushrooms. On June 5th, Oakland, California decriminalized the cultivation, possession, and use of plants and fungi containing psychedelic compounds. Moving forward to September 4th, Johns Hopkins launched the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research to be directed by Dr. Roland Griffiths. Moving forward to 2020, on January 28th, Santa Cruz, California decriminalized the cultivation, possession of psychedelic plants and fungi. Last month, August 4th, Canadian Health Minister Patty Hajdu approved psilocybin mushrooms for patients with terminal cancer diagnoses. This was spearheaded by the efforts of Therasil. And then less than a week ago, on September 14th, UC Berkeley launched or has announced their launching of the campus's first Center for the Science of Psychedelics. So as you can see, tremendous history, a lot of things to take into consideration when just having conversations surrounding these compounds. It's truly remarkable. And we have thank you for a lot of the efforts to everyone here on this timeline, and especially thank you to Carlos Pozzola and Spencer Hawkswell, the co-founder CEO of Decrim Nature and Therastil, to be on today to speak about their efforts. So I mentioned to you guys I would talk about what a Schedule 1's controlled substance is defined as. So there is no accepted medical use in the United States is one criteria. The next is that there's a lack of accepted safety for the use under medical supervision. And then lastly, it has a high potential for abuse. This is physiological and physical. And then just a quick overview, so the potential indications for therapy. So we have listed here, based off clinical trials, we have major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, addiction, and cluster headaches. These have been shown through clinical trials. Now, when it comes to breakthrough designation, 2 indications so far, being major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. Breakthrough therapy is when the FDA expedites drug development because the preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement on a clinical significant endpoint over available therapies. And then here's a list of the studies underway utilizing psilocybin. So we have opioid use disorder to microdosing, anorexia. There's a lot of potential here, guys, a lot of potential. So with that being said, really appreciate you guys taking the time to hear about a quick overview and history of psilocybin. I am going to go ahead and check to make sure that our next speaker is available. So give me one moment. A bit of lag on my laptop. Hey, you guys there? Cool, we're back. Sorry, I have a really old laptop, and as soon as I try doing something, just shut off on me. Can you guys hear me well? Audio all good? Awesome. Cool. Great. Thanks, guys. And were we able to get through the last presentation all right? Did we wrap up with the potential indications for psilocybin? Cool. Great. All right. So next we have listed for as our presenter to be Scott Fisher. Let's go see, and Scott Fisher is ready to chat. Okay, adding him now as a panelist. And Roberta, I noticed your question of opioid use disorder, or OUD, that's opioid use disorder. Thank you, Michael, for answering that. Additionally, everyone, just so you are aware, there is a Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to drop your questions in there, so that way there's a little bit more organization separating the chat box with the questions that you guys are all asking. So with that being said, let me go ahead and give Scott capabilities to screen share. Okay, Scott, can you share your screen now?
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. So everyone, all right. We good? Okay. So I will get started here with my presentation. So my presentation is titled Psilocybin in Mental Health Treatment, an Old New Paradigm, or it could have been called a New Old Paradigm. So this is me, Scott Fisher. I am a psychiatrist as well as psychedelic psychotherapist. I'm currently a therapist or lead facilitator for the USONA-sponsored trial PSIL-201, the Florida site that's in Lauderhill, Florida. I was certified at the program, as I mentioned, in psychedelic therapy at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I did that program in 2018. We learned that program is mostly focused on psilocybin as well as the MAPS MDMA assisted therapy training, also general psychiatrist. Okay, so our trial is focusing on major depressive disorder. Depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. 33% don't achieve any response to treatment, and the ones that do, many get partial or incomplete response. So there's a big need for better treatments, especially considering depression rates have tripled in the US since the COVID pandemic started, and 800,000 people commit suicide worldwide each year. So also, looking back a little bit at the history, I always loved the word in the indigenous language, Teo Nanakado, flesh of the gods or fungus of the gods, and such a poetic way of referring to this fungus. Same mushroom stones. Yeah, so in the 1500s, the Spanish basically suppressed all mushroom use. They thought it was devil worship or satanic, didn't fit with their Catholic views. So it went underground, and it wasn't really until the 20th century, and in particular, this R. Gordon Wasson was given this gift from Maria Sabina, like we'd mentioned, and he published this big article in Life magazine that kind of really introduced Western culture to it on a much broader scope. And it's also around that time that LSD was becoming big. In the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s for a little while, there was a lot of psychedelic research going on, thousands and thousands of patients treated. It looked very promising. That research is pretty outdated at this point in terms of, could that be used to make psilocybin and other psychedelics in medicine? No, it wasn't of the quality needed. That's why all these modern trials are going on. So we are trying to assess, is psilocybin a rapid acting antidepressant? And there's two major trials going on right now. Phase 2, which would lead into phase 3, which would be the pivotal trials for approving psilocybin as a medicine. The Usona one that I work with is for any major depressive disorder, as opposed to Compass Pathways as the group looking at treatment-resistant depression. So for major depression, you could not have had any treatment. This could be your first episode, and you could get psilocybin, which is kind of more inclusive and broader indication, which I find very exciting. So rapid acting antidepressant versus short acting. So our current kind of medications and treatments, they're slow acting, they can take weeks to kick in, they must be taken on every day, and people often take them for months, sometimes even years. You know, there's plenty of people that have been taking the same medication for 20, 30 years, which if it works for them, great, but it doesn't always work that well. There can be side effects. And if you're someone who doesn't want to take a medication every day, then those are some big downsides. Psilocybin belongs to a new model of treatments where we're hoping it can work right away. In the trial we're doing, we're going to measure the primary outcome 7 days after. So we're trying to see if this can work almost immediately within a week, and whether you only need to give, you know, a few treatments. Our trial is only one single dose of psilocybin. Some of the other psychedelic therapy trials have been at least a few more doses. So this is just one single dose. How good is it at treating depression is what we're trying to assess. It's definitely worth noting this isn't just a drug or a medication. This is a package deal with psychotherapy. You need to have trained professionals there because of how, you know, powerful the experiences can be. You're so altered. People can exercise bad judgment under the influence of these. You need someone there. You know, trip sitter was the old term, but even better to have a trained therapist who, there's kind of 3 phases: preparation, so getting someone sort of prepared for the experience, the actual dosing day, and then integration sessions of the dosing afterwards. As you can see in the dosing day, we're really trying to make people experience an inward journey. You wear eye masks, you have headphones, therapists are there for support if needed, but you're not necessarily talking, at least with the psilocybin treatments, a lot of the time. You're kind of having the experience. And that is what we think heals people, is the experience that they have while taking the medicine. So the potential applications we talked a little bit about. There are active trials right now in depression, anxiety, as well as alcoholism, cocaine dependence, anorexia, OCD. There's been a lot of promise for smoking cessation. And then there's also, of course, potential non-medical uses beyond these kind of more strict medical indications. Education, spiritual use, creativity, among many others. So how does psilocybin help people? Well, one thing it can do is give people some sort of insight into their own psychology, release from negative emotions. There's an instrument called the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory, which is basically a questionnaire looking at, are people able to kind of face difficult emotions? Are they able to release from past traumas? Are they able to understand themselves in certain ways, face emotions they can't normally face, and feel some sort of sense of closure? Emotional closure can be another big one. So that can happen with the psilocybin. That's also with the MDMA therapy, one of the big kind of things that they're hoping to achieve when they give people MDMA for PTSD. That there is also what we would call the mystical, spiritual, religious experience. There are also instruments or questionnaires to measure the level of that. And so I think it's worth talking a little bit about what that kind of is defined of science-wise. So this was published in 2006, one of the coolest, I think, kind of papers ever, at least the title. And the paper itself is really interesting. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. This was a phase 1 trial, so a safety trial, but then they got to do all these cool sub-analyses. So how do you define a mystical experience? There's a lot of different ways you could do it, but this is kind of how the scientists are doing it. So there's the mysticism scale. One thing that is looked at is transcendence of time and space. So I have had an experience which is both timeless and spaceless, which is very different than our normal day-to-day where space and time are very much felt, of course. I have had an experience in which ultimate reality was revealed to me. So some sort of knowledge or noesis happened that seems extremely important and kind of overarching for all existence. I've had an experience which left me with a feeling of awe. So this is positive mood, sense of reverence, a sense of the power. I've had an experience in which all things seem to be unified into a single whole. So that sense of unity that the universe seems to embody during a mystical experience. I've experienced profound joy. So again, the deeply felt positive mood. I've had an experience in which all things seem to be conscious. I have had an experience which I knew to be sacred. I have had an experience in which everything seemed to disappear from my mind until I was conscious of only a void. A dramatic effect there. And then I've had an experience which cannot be expressed in words, or a sense of the ineffable. It's just beyond description. So the results of that trial showed that 60% with a relatively large dose of psilocybin had a complete mystical experience where, all those questions plus a bunch of other ones, they were like, yes, yes, yes. 2 months later, 2/3 said it was one of the 5 most meaningful experiences of their life, on par with the birth of their first child or death of a parent. 1/3 said it was the single most spiritually significant experience of their entire lives. So extremely powerful experiences were induced. And anxiety and paranoia could happen during the session, but it didn't really impact the likelihood of having a mystical experience, which kind of shows that people really do go on trips or journeys with psychedelic therapy. So subsequent clinical studies have shown the degree of improvement with psychedelic therapy treatments is correlated with the subjective effects of having a mystical experience and or emotional breakthrough. So, there's a lot of studies being done about what is happening, with the 5-HT2A, serotonin 2A, activation, the default mode network, so many things we don't understand about, the brain that we're trying to assess. But if people have these mystical or spiritual experiences, they seem to get better, these emotional breakthroughs, which is also probably why the same sort of treatment can work so well for so many different indications, is because the psychology, there's a lot of overlap in terms of what's happening there. So that is the end of my presentation. If anyone ever wants to reach out to me, this is my email. And thank you all for listening. I'll appreciate any questions you might have later.
Thank you so much for that, Scott.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, next we'll be bringing on Dr. Michelle Weiner for her presentation today. Yeah, it is right now. And as Dr. Fisher mentioned, we will be answering questions at the end of this event. So everyone has been allocated roughly 7 minutes for every presentation. And then at the very end, we'll have Dustin, the co-founder of Mr. Psychedelic Law, introduce key concepts to the resolution he'd like to propose throughout Florida. And then we'll be answering Q&A as a collective panel. So thank you guys for that. All right, so I accidentally forgot to introduce Dr. Fisher, but I'm happy that he was able to introduce himself. So thanks for that, Doc. Regarding Dr. Michelle Weiner, she is a double board certified in interventional pain management and physical medicine and rehabilitation. She is the chair of the Florida Medical Marijuana Advisory Committee and the vice chair president of Mr. Psychedelic Law. She practices integrative pain management, offering individualized holistic treatment options with the goal of cultivating health and preventing chronic disease. Her research on using cannabis as a substitute for opioids in chronic pain management and among seniors is what led her to speak today. So Dr. Michelle Weiner, if you'd like to go ahead and share your presentation, and I'll hop off.
All right. So can we all see the presentation?
Oh yeah.
Okay, we're good to go. All right, so today I'm talking about psilocybin and end-of-life care. And I am an integrative pain management physician, and I have a lot of experience with cannabis. And so I have cancer patients, I have a lot of end-of-life patients that were all frustrated with the current status because cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug, psilocybin is a Schedule 1 drug, and so a lot of patients are suffering at the end of their life. And why do we die so poorly in America? It's really because we have this medical system that because these drugs are Schedule 1, we only have access to things like morphine and Ativan to be administered by the hospice nurses. And it's not a human way of treating patients at the end of their lives. The other thing is that when we have anxiety and depression at the end of life, oftentimes it can lead the patient to not adhere to the treatment plan. And when they are anxious and depressed, they get frustrated, they start to give up on their medical model, and they start to have complications. And so we do have these mind manifesting medications like psilocybin, and the purpose is really to cultivate connection, compassion, gratitude, especially at the end of life, to form some type of meaning and have them have purpose. And so really the word healing means wholeness, and we want people at the end of their lives to feel as whole as they possibly can. And as Scott Fisher just reviewed, the mystical experiences, these are the main features of a mystical experience. And again, it's very dose dependent. So when we're talking about psilocybin and the end of life studies, we're going to talk between low and high doses. And so unity, or this sense that we're all connected, that the sacredness, positive mood or joy, ineffability means you can't even put into words the way that you're feeling during these experiences. The noetic quality is the profound sense that we're encountering ultimate reality or knowledge, which is very interesting because the guides will tell the patients to follow their innate wisdom. And that noetic quality is something that we take for granted, and we talk about it now with the mystical experience. And then transcendence is probably the most important, which is there's no difference between past, present, and future, and time or space. And so I'm going to review two studies. One was by Roland Griffith, and now he's at UCLA using psilocybin. The hypothesis was with targeted psychotherapy, there can be a significant reduction in anxiety and depression in patients with life-threatening cancer. And it's really important to see how I highlighted targeted psychotherapy, because it's not just the psilocybin, it's the fact that they are actually preparing the patients for weeks before these sessions, and that they are having therapy after these sessions. So even though it's a 6-hour journey for the patient where they're sitting with music and their eyes are closed in a very comfortable environment, the therapy is extremely important to the success of this study. And so this study had 51 cancer patients, and they were either given a low or a high dose of psilocybin. Low was 1 or 3 milligrams per 70 kilogram person, and the high was 22 milligrams. And you see in orange that the high dose group, in orange here, there was 92% who received the high dose. After 5 weeks after the session, there was clinical significant improvement in depression. So it actually goes to show how it was sustained for 5 weeks, and then 80% sustained out to 6 months. So this is, again, a cancer population at the end of their lives. More than 80% of them up to 6 months are feeling significant less depression. And again, it's showing how one single exposure to psilocybin, which is really unprecedented in medicine or in psychiatry. This study was done with Hopkins and NYU with Ross and Bossis, and similar, it was an FDA-approved clinical trial, randomized double-blind crossover, 7-week trial with 29 subjects. And they received one dose. Again, they prepared them for 4 weeks prior. They all had to have anxiety, depression at the end of their lives. And they took a capsule, and the the instructions or the guidelines were to trust the guides, to trust your own innate wisdom or consciousness, to be open to whatever arises. A lot of patients, obviously could have moved into this fear of death or had some type of anxiety provoking experience. However, all of their experiences had incredible insight afterwards. And this is the room in which they used for the study, where they would lie on the couch. And here you see in purple is the psilocybin versus placebo is in blue. So one day after the session, there was a reduction in anxiety and depression, and then 7 weeks after that was sustained. And the same thing with demoralization and hopelessness or despair or the feeling of not having purpose. So in purple, you see how the psilocybin group had significant reduction in hopelessness. And 70% of the participants rated the psilocybin experience as the top 5 most meaningful, significant experiences of their lifetime. Nearly 90% improvement in general well-being and life satisfaction. Again, this is an end-of-life population. So it's important to talk about intention and having an intention. Obviously, their intention of the experience was for them to have less anxiety or depression at the end of their lives. And so they say these are meaning-making molecules and that we're wired for these experiences. And that to me is extremely interesting, because when we think about cannabis, for example, we have the cannabinoid receptors, we have an endocannabinoid system, we were given the cannabis plant. It's very similar. We're actually wired for these experiences, but in a supported environment, in the right setting, the right dose, with the right intention, we can have a very meaningful experience and foster a greater acceptance of dying. So there's that underlying, everything is eternal, the appreciation for love and for nature with these experiences, and the fact that these patients are not just their diseases, that they are not defined by the end of their lives, they're not defined by their cancer, for example. And so I'm just going to close with this, which is a picture of a text that I received on Friday. This man was my first cannabis patient, and he also used cannabis towards the end of his life. And the reason I bring it up is to show you how this man died with dignity. He died at home. He died without any pharmaceuticals for pain, for anxiety, for sleep, because we use cannabis. And that's a daily medication. Psilocybin, on the other hand, is just one time of one medication given at one time that can have such a profound effect on the patient and the family. And also, being that it is the Jewish New Year, we always like to say, be intentional. And I think that's very symbolic of what's going on currently right now, and also in this psychedelic movement. So I think that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation, Doctor. Okay, up next we have Spencer Hawkswell. Spencer is the CEO of Therasil, a group of health professionals who seek to make psilocybin, psychedelic medicine, legally available to Canadians in need of compassionate treatment for severe psychological distress. I'll be bringing him on momentarily. See if he pops in.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, I think I might just need you to turn my video on there.
One sec. Okay, how's that look? Great.
There we go.
All right.
Awesome.
All you, man.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here to speak. So yeah, I am the CEO of Therasil. We are a nonprofit healthcare coalition, and we have a 4-pillar mission. And our first pillar is access to treatment, and that is access to specifically psilocybin for end-of-life distress. The other 2 pillars of our mission are education, both for the public and for healthcare practitioners. So that is teaching the public about the merits and limitations of psilocybin, and also making sure that we have healthcare professionals that are trained. I realize in Canada here, we probably got to train a couple thousand therapists in the next couple of years to keep up with the demand of citizens that are going to be seeking substances like psilocybin and MDMA for treatment as they become more popular. And finally, the last pillar of our mission is research. So we would love to be able to get some on-the-ground applied research happening within our communities. What we do is we act, and myself specifically, I work as a patient advocate, and our team is quite small here. We're located in Victoria on Vancouver Island, so the Pacific Northwest. And TheraSil was started by our founder, Bruce Tobin, about 3 years ago. He started it after he had learned about the process by which AIDS patients got access to cannabis back in, I believe, the year 2000 here in Canada. One of the pieces of our what's it called? Our Charter of Rights here in Canada is Section 7, and that says that all Canadians have the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. And it was this clause within our charter that got the first patients access to cannabis 20 years ago. So Bruce Tobin thought, why not do the exact same thing, but this time gear it towards end-of-life patients seeking access to psilocybin. And that was back in 2017 that he put out an application seeking access to psilocybin for him and his clinical team to treat these patients. Now, that sat in a government bureaucracy purgatory, if you will, for about 3 years. And it wasn't until 2019 that it was rejected. So that would have been last December that it was rejected. And at the same time I came on board, and we decided that we would take a more patient-centered approach, which fantastically has led us to develop this organization to be patient-centered, and is also the reason why I believe we've succeeded up here in getting psilocybin access to dying Canadians. The way we did this was we wrote the exact same Section 56 applications, but to our health minister, Patty Hajdu. The reason we did this is because there is a process that you can apply to access Schedule J or Schedule 3 narcotics in Canada through our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And this is the very act that sets limitations on access to drugs, such as psilocybin or heroin or cannabis. So what this clause says is that the minister may approve any person or class of persons from any piece of the or any piece of the act. And so what that means is that if the minister wants to give someone access to psilocybin or cannabis, like she did in the year 2000, that they can do that on whatever grounds they deem necessary. And so what we did is we asked for access for the patients that we were helping on compassionate grounds. The reason I think this was so powerful is, first, as I was saying, there were real patients here, real dying Canadians that were seeking to get access, two of which have been very public. There's Thomas Hartle out of Saskatchewan and Laurie Brooks from here in BC. Both of these two patients are the reason that psilocybin has been essentially made accessible through Section 56. They were brave. They were willing to expose themselves and their personal medical information and history to the broader Canadian public in order to show why they deserve access to psilocybin, and thus why other Canadians deserve access. Here in Canada, we have something called medical assistance in dying, and MAID, and that is essentially euthanasia. You are allowed to kill yourself if you're in enough pain. So the argument that these patients were working on with our government was, if you give us the right to die, why would we not have the right to try? The right to try something that might better our life, or the remaining days of our life, and help us die with dignity. And this is a very powerful argument for obvious reasons. If your government is only going to allow you to kill yourself as a treatment option when all other treatments have failed, and they won't give you access to something like a mushroom that has passed phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, then court becomes a very easy option. But we are fortunate enough that we did not have to go to court. We do indeed have a very compassionate government that listens to its citizens, and that was demonstrated wonderfully through the campaign we ran and through the response from Patty Hajdu, our Minister of Health, and from the folks at our Office of Controlled Substances. So at the end of the day, this really is activism. It is activism by taking the very people that would benefit from this, which is not the doctors, which is not the therapists, but the actual patients that they seek to help, and putting them in front of the decision makers and saying, you know, you can say no to doctors and therapists that are not dying and that are okay, but you cannot say no to your citizens, to your constituents, if you're speaking with MPs, because the healthcare system is designed to help them. So I realized that this is something different than perhaps what you've got down in Florida and in the US. In Canada, we're fortunate to have a federal healthcare system. So whether you're the Prime Minister's child or no matter where you live in Canada, you all have the same. We all have the same health access, and so it means making decisions is very easy from Health Canada. It's really just our minister, and so when a decision based on compassion is granted, it really does set a precedent. And since those first 4 applications were granted to these patients on August 4th, 2 more applications have made it through, this time with about only 10 days. So this is the type of activism that we do. But I'll now just jump quickly into what we do as far as public education and professional education goes. And first off, we want to make sure that while we're opening up a reasonable and legal access to psilocybin, we want to make sure we do it responsibly. So in the past couple months, we've had hundreds of Canadians messaging us asking about access to psilocybin. Many of these people have incurable cancer or a palliative diagnosis and are seeking this to help with their end of life distress. Many of them have heard the stories of the last couple treatments that have been very successful, by the way. We've had those patients speaking on live webinars and sharing their accounts of what happened and how they were helped by psilocybin. And while this is all great, we do realize that we have a problem now, and that is with hundreds of Canadians seeking access to psilocybin, there are not enough healthcare professionals to know how to deliver the treatment. So training is absolutely something that is going to be important here in Canada, and that we realize is part of activism, part of access, is making sure that healthcare practitioners are completely aware of the differences between more traditional psychotherapies and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. As for the public too, making sure that they're aware of the merits and limitations and that we are not promoting unsafe use of psilocybin is critical in the way that we're working with our government. We don't want to be irresponsible, and we want to make this as well lubricated a process as possible. And I think that happens when a company or organization such as us acts responsibly. Finally, we're really interested in soon doing some clinical, non-clinical, some applied research. So much of the research that I'm sure many of the people on this call are aware of, or we've been speaking about, is all really done in a vacuum in a lab, and this is great for research. I mean, you need to be able to control variables and make sure that nothing is interfering with the science that you're trying, or in this case, the molecule that you're running an experiment on. However, when you take something like psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and you apply it to the real world, all of a sudden you have to start worrying about things like contraindications and drug interactions. And so this may give you very different results. So what we hope to be doing is supporting about 100 patients over the next couple months in some observational research to essentially document how their experiences go and what happens when they're on a host of different drugs, or if they have other indications or comorbidities that we have not done any research yet on. We want to be able to make that very open to other researchers and add that to the medical literature on psilocybin end of life. So I think that's all the time I've got here, but that's just a bit about what TheraPsil is and the work we're doing here.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Spencer. Really appreciate that overview. Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Training is super important to meet that demand for the for incoming psychedelic navigators. So thank you so much for all the work you're doing with TheraPsil.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, next we have Eric Range. So Eric, he serves as a board director for the nonprofit organization Minorities for Medical Marijuana. This organization is a leading voice on public policy, patient advocacy, business development, and social justice issues in the cannabis industry. So with that being said, Eric is going to speak today about a lot of these subjects and its importance when it comes to psychedelic reform. Eric, I'll let you go ahead and take it away. Eric, I asked to unmute you, so maybe you can try pressing the box that comes up in a sec. There you go.
Okay.
Hey, there he is.
All right. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Loud and
All
clear,
right.
man. All you.
I'm gonna share my screen again.
Cool.
Let's see. Make sure we. All right. Can you guys see my screen? We're good.
Yes, sir.
All right. Good. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I think this is such an important conversation, especially here in the state of Florida and around the country. It's always good when folks from various different backgrounds come together and kind of share information and thoughts and ideas. And I think that's the real catalyst to us moving the ball forward. So thank you guys for having me. Again, my name is Eric Range. I serve as a board chair for Minorities for Medical Marijuana. We're the largest or one of the largest minority nonprofit organizations in the cannabis industry. We focus a lot on the medical marijuana side of things, as the name implies, but as adult use and recreational has come up, as industrial hemp has come up, and now as we talk about psychedelics, we are oftentimes pulled into the conversation to make sure that minority voices are at the table, that as decisions are being made and as an industry is being built, we're considering all aspects of, community living. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go in. Uh-oh, here we go. We're still there. All right. So why is it important for diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And DEI just stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the cannabis industry, obviously, there's a history of targeted abuse to certain communities. And that's why there's such a huge push for social equity and social justice. Obviously, when we talk about psychedelics, it is not quite the same justification. However, I think there are some parallels there, and I'll try to draw those connections. I think the very first reason why this work is important is because as this new industry comes online, as psychedelics grow in popularity, as we have more physicians who are using this in treatment, as we have more patients who are seeking this treatment, we have a real opportunity to build an industry without the inherent biases that we've seen in all other industries prior to this one. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity for us to get it right at the onset, as long as we're having these dialogues and these conversations about what is needed. I think we also have an opportunity to build better communities and build better businesses. I'm going to talk a little bit about, why I think it's important that we, what led me here today basically was because I've recognized that while I'm still very new and learning quite a bit as it pertains to psychedelics for medical treatment, I recognize that there's certainly a need to talk about healthcare disparities in certain communities and how this may be a viable treatment. So I think through this, we have an opportunity to build better communities and better businesses. There are, the COVID-19 crisis has really and truly highlighted for us the gross disparities and failures in the healthcare system that exists in our most vulnerable communities. And so, as we again look at how we bring on this new treatment, I want to be a part of the conversation, and I hope that those of you who are in other conversations outside of this one today, that you're thinking about how do you include those communities who have been most harmed, those communities who are most vulnerable and how we can get them involved in treatment as well. Marginalized communities experience trauma that lead to all kinds of depression. And when I talk about marginalized communities, I'm talking about communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs, by the war on poverty, exploitation of communities of color, systemic racism, abuse by law enforcement. All of that amounts to trauma and leads to a number of different medical conditions like depression, suicidal ideations, and so on. So these are all reasons why I personally feel is really important that wherever you are in this space, whatever conversations you're participating in, that we are thinking about those marginalized communities, those communities who are who really and truly have bore the brunt and are among the most vulnerable. And I'm always one who likes to highlight where we may have problem areas, or as I like to call them, areas of opportunity, like we did on the last slide. I think we also have to look for solutions. And so, how do we encourage minority communities, to be represented and to participate in both treatment as well as the industry and advocating for this? And so I think there's a number of things that we can do. We can create legislation that prioritizes communities, in particular, when we talk about, again, those most vulnerable communities, most impacted communities, having them prioritize in our legislation for getting the fastest relief, just as we've done, as some of the previous speakers have talked about with those end-of-life patients, those being a priority group of patients that we're looking to administer this treatment to. I think a case could be built or made for prioritizing, the vulnerable communities and those communities who deal with a lot of trauma from a lot of different social justice and social issues. Earmark funding for community-based healthcare education programs. One of the things we've learned quite a bit in the cannabis industry, in particular when we're looking at reaching communities of color, communities who have been most impacted, we have to work with those community-based organizations and healthcare providers who are already in these communities, who have built trust, who have access to stakeholders, who can speak on behalf of the community and find ways to engage the community. And so I think it's important that as legislation is being written, as we look at finding ways, or as the state and local communities extract different tax revenues from businesses, from the commoditization of psychedelics, we want to look at how do we earmark some of that funding for community-based programs and education programs. As an industry, we also have to, look at connecting with other organizations from outside of psychedelics. For instance, Minorities for Medical Marijuana. Again, we're very new to the conversation, but being one of the largest organizations in the cannabis side and having 25 chapters around the country, having built the trust, again, in these communities who have been, we have been at the ground floor, if you will. And so as an industry, we need to connect with not just Minorities for Medical Marijuana, but others who are around there. And it may not just be from the cannabis industry, it can be from other healthcare industries, but connecting with those community organizations, to help spread the message. Developing incubators and accelerators. There is undoubtedly going to be some form of commerce that is associated with this new treatment. And we want to make sure that we find ways to encourage minorities to participate in that. And so creating incubators and accelerators is a good way to help them learn about the ins and outs of the industry and to set themselves up for long-term sustainability. And then also another reason what I'm learning is that many in the who are advocates of the psychedelic, as a medicinal treatment, are beginning to find the North Star Pledge which talks a little bit, and I'm sorry these are coming up kind of oddly here, but these are the different 7 tenets of that North Star Pledge. And, you know, one of them, or I'll go through them really quick. Start within is the first pillar. Study the traditions, build trust, consider the gravity, focus on process, create equality and justice, and pay it forward. And I bring this up because I think it's important. I think as industries are being developed and we're making these type of pledges to create equity and social and justice, this is a very much or a very important component of it. And I think this is another reason why it's so important for us to consider diversity, equity, and inclusion as this new treatment and industry comes online. And that's basically it. You guys can find me and my organization. We're always looking for new partnerships, new groups to work with, advocates, to try to push the issue and make sure that communities of color, communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs, are gaining access to new treatments and new economic opportunities. So here's my information. And again, I thank you guys for joining us today. And I'll look out for questions in the question and answer session.
Hey, thank you so much for that, Eric. One cool comment by Elizabeth in the chat. You know, equity, justice, and right relations with plant medicines are really important. You know, that's very well said, Elizabeth. Yeah, thank you again, Eric, for that. Carlos just messaged you, Eric, asking hoping to connect with the Decrim Nature movement. And it's a perfect segue. So we have Carlos Pozzola hopping on next. Let me go ahead and just add him here. One moment. So Carlos Pozzola, he is a political, community, and social justice organizer. He's an entrepreneur, real estate developer, and a service provider. He is also the co-founder of Decriminalize Nature, which has now become an international organization in over 100 cities and 6 countries. It's really exciting. Carlos, we're really happy to have you here today, and I'll let you take it away, man.
Thank you, Syed. I'm glad to be here. I'm actually shortly going to ask you to repost that beautiful timeline that you did, if you don't mind, if you're able to. And then I want to hold for just a second here so I can speak to your audience, and let me start my timer. My own background, I was a social justice organizer for about 8 years, a political organizer for about 12, 13 years, worked in politics, passed policy, ran campaigns. Spent 6 years in medical cannabis and cannabis in general from 2000 through 2000, actually about 11 years through 2014. I was involved in somewhere or another in medical cannabis. Spent 15 years in building companies, including real estate development companies and consulting companies. So I've sort of dabbled in a lot of different pieces of the world. I want to speak a bit about my own. Thank you. I appreciate the slide here. The reason I wanted to bring this up is where I appreciate Eric Range's presentation. In addition to ensuring that people of color, vulnerable communities get a seat at the table in what is pretty much a Western model of approach to healing, I also, and Decrim Nature is advocating for ensuring that traditional communities, traditional approaches to healing find space in this movement, and that we join together to advocate for ensuring that the traditional approaches, and by that I mean that pre-capitalism, there existed use of many of these medicines, as you allude to here, 5000 BCE, 1500 BCE, up until 1955, when 1959, when mushroom and psilocybin was brought into the Western world. And then you'll sort of see here from 1959 on, it becomes largely white men and largely Western medicine approaching plant healing work in the US. Before that, it was all traditional communities using plant medicines and developing that technology for tens of thousands of years, and the technologies were developed to such an extent that it's now become one of the preferred ways of healing for even doctors and psychiatrists and therapists to travel to Peru, travel to Costa Rica and other places to do their own healing within ceremony. And when I had my own mushroom journey in 2018, and as a result actually of How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan's book, reading that, and I went to find community, what I found was this incredible underground community here in the Bay Area that was made up of doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, and just long-term practitioners who learned from ancient practices, indigenous communities throughout the world, and had brought it back into our Western communities. They themselves oftentimes preferred the community-based approach, a community container approach to healing. And so what we are suggesting is that in addition to everything that my brother Eric Range suggests, which I think is fantastic, that we also, as a community of clinicians, doctors, psychiatrists, and more community-based practitioners, is that we carve out enough space for both of us to coexist. We know that in a world of capitalism, particularly in our world here, where we're seeing an increase in authoritarianism emerge based on erosion of a democratic process, because of such a strong focus on the profiteering motive at the expense of other things like love, like compassion, like community-based models of economic development, that there's a tremendous amount of depression, a tremendous amount of isolation that emerges from the disconnect from the sacred. So our intention in Decrim Nature really is to advocate for the preservation of a bottom-up community-based approach. And thank you for your slide. What I'd like to do now is, if you'll give me control over this, spend the next 4 minutes sharing with you our approach. Thank you. All right, let me try to share slides, slideshow. Okay, so we are Decrim Nature. This is our website. We have over 100 cities now participating in 6 countries. So the first part is creating a movement. Our movement is based on, was founded in January 5th, 2019. 6 founding members met and said, first and foremost, let's advocate for protection of love and all the things that emerge from it: compassion, justice, generosity, community, and service. Love is the core ethos of our community and our movement. And it's in juxtaposition to then a fear-based society that we've sort of helped create here, where we have this level of polarization that's going on in the world. We are definitely advocates and connecting with nature. The plants, anthogenic plants and fungi enable us to do that, as an earlier speaker mentioned. We are about consciousness justice, and think of this as every human consciousness has the right to fulfill their highest level of being. But in our current state, not only physical incarceration, we're seeing extensive mental incarceration, consciousness incarceration due to extreme trauma for all of us, but particularly the war on drugs, the war on race, the war on poverty that we've seen emerge in our Western model of political and economic models. We definitely learn from and advocate honoring and supporting ancient and ancestral wisdom. And of course, we advocate equitable access, which means at the end of the day, my brother mentioned COVID and the inequitable access to medicine and healing, and the impacts being inequitable in particularly marginalized communities. It's important to ensure that there's full access, not just to the medicines, the entheogenic plants and fungi, but also to ceremony. So this is where we're at now throughout the US and actually 9 countries now. Part 2 is developing a regulatory framework, which we've proposed here in Oakland. It's called the Oakland Community Healing Initiative. There's 4 basic pieces to it. One is that the city attorney's office would protect community-based ceremony in exchange for community opting into safe practice guidelines. This helps build a culture of safe use in our communities, again, in partnership with all of the professionals in our community, all of the longtime practitioners. I'll skip those. Phase 1 is passing the ordinance, which would lead to legal protections from the city. Phase 2 would then be to look at creating community-based economic models. And what we'd like to do here is ensure that our communities, our most marginalized communities, are not afterthought equity participants in a movement, but rather front and center in a movement in helping develop jobs in the industry through service providing, cultivation, distribution that helps build jobs and services in our local communities in a way that is local as opposed to extractive with venture capital in the lead. Our model is this: at the center, there's the CBOs that are doing the work with their community, with the most marginalized. That's the inner bubble here. The next bubble out is the City of Oakland Community Healing Framework. And then we've now hired lobbyists to pass this at the state of California through a pilot program where the state would then protect the city's rights to protect the local community's rights to do community-based healing. And this is the basic framework. We have CBOs. They're supported by Western medicine practitioners, doctors, psychiatrists, et cetera, global indigenous healers, the wisdom of this, urban inner city existing healing modalities such as radical healing models, and then finally Western-based facilitators that are underground who have learned a tremendous amount from all of these folks. And so they would all come together. They are all the subject matter experts, but the person doing the healing is the individual. So they have local agency, which is really, this is our community that developed the ordinance here locally. And the reason we want to put this in a community container is because the work is the path. It's different to have a compound in a capsule, different to have a one-time ceremony with an entheogen or ayahuasca or mushrooms than to daily walk the path of healing. That is evaluating your relationships, evaluating your own patterns. And this is where having a community container is important. And that container can also include, of course, Western medical clinical providers. Last slide here is that, we are working with Denver, with Oregon now, Oakland, and working toward a both and approach, as opposed to an either or approach of both bottom-up traditional healing and Western clinical medicine medical approach, where we recognize that they can all coexist. And in fact, if we're going to transform our society to be more compassionate, they have to coexist. And that wraps up my presentation. Sorry for going over a little bit there. Thank you.
Thank you, man. That was well done. Very well done. Thank you for providing all that information. In the chat, guys, I posted the Decrim Nature web link. Additionally, there is a PDF that came out not too long ago about their handbook for their organizers. Carlos, did you want to touch upon that at all?
Yeah, if you go to our website, which is decriminalizenature.org, and you look for organizers handbook, it's about 120 pages of all of our resources. You can organize your own decrim nature in your own community. We give you all the tools to do it, and we'll even support you in building your first meeting and building your own local organization. Ann Arbor, by the way, is coming tomorrow to council for initial hearing, and we've been supporting them in that effort.
Nice. Cool. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Sam Chapman. I'll go ahead and bring him on right now. Thank you again, Carlos. We'll see you in a little bit with the Q&A. So Sam Chapman is the campaign manager on the Yes on Measure 109 campaign, aka psilocybin therapy in Oregon, which is the ballot measure campaign seeking to create the first ever statewide regulated psilocybin therapy program in the United States. Sam has over a decade of experience in advocating for progressive drug policy reforms at the local, state, and national level. His previous experience includes grassroots organizing, consulting for state and local political campaigns, assisting local governments in writing rules and regulations with a focus on equitable licensing, and identifying new opportunities within emerging industries. In 2013, Sam co-authored House Bill 3460, the Oregon law that legalized medical marijuana dispensaries. Sam has been a resident of Oregon for 24 years. He holds a bachelorette degree from the University of Oregon in philosophy and political science. Sam, thank you so much for being here. I'll let you take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I know that we've only got a brief amount of time, and so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into this presentation here. So as I'm sure many people on this call already know, there's a mental health crisis here in America. Unfortunately, here in Oregon, that crisis is even more acute. According to Mental Health America, Oregon actually has the most severe mental health crisis in the country. That was prior to COVID. Obviously, COVID has compounded the rates at which people are experiencing depression, anxiety, et cetera, here in Oregon. And so we are very excited to be able to offer those people new tools for combating depression, anxiety, and addiction here in Oregon. So as I'm sure many people are familiar around the psilocybin research that exists at major leading medical institutions such as Johns Hopkins, UCLA, NYU, showing that psilocybin can be uniquely effective in helping, again, people who are suffering from depression, end-of-life anxiety, and addiction. And for those who are not already familiar, it shows so much promise that the FDA has granted psilocybin therapy as a breakthrough therapy designation for treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder, meaning that it may demonstrate substantial improvement above and beyond what is currently available today. So to the measure, and actually I'm realizing I'm gonna need to stop sharing and reshare because I forgot to hit the sound button. Bear with me. This is a quick 2-minute video that does a really good job explaining what our measure does and does not do.
Almost all of us in Oregon have a friend or neighbor who struggles with mental health challenges. These are everyday problems, even before the pandemic and recession. Depression, anxiety, addiction. Too many Oregonians have spent years moving from medication to medication and doctor to doctor with little relief for feelings of severe depression or anxiety. We need other options. Those other options may soon be available. There's new research being conducted on therapy using psilocybin, a plant medicine. It's being studied for mental health benefits now at New York University, Johns Hopkins University, UCLA. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration found that it's a, quote, breakthrough therapy, giving a green light to path-breaking research. Psilocybin therapy would be regulated, permitted only in licensed offices, and not legalized for recreational use. There would be a controlled framework with strict safeguards in place. It takes place with a licensed and trained facilitator after a thorough evaluation and screening process. In a preparation session in the days before, you discuss the details of the day and what to expect from the session itself. On the day of the treatment, the client takes the psilocybin and experiences the effects, always with guidance and supervision. After the session ends, in an integration session in the days after, the client returns to discuss the experience, interpret what happened, and how to put it to good use in the future. Pioneering research studies show psilocybin therapy may help people break troublesome mental patterns and find new ways to cope with past traumas and difficulties. And it helps them do so without resorting to high daily doses of pharmaceuticals with all kinds of side effects. People are living happier lives. It's a new approach, worth considering.
So big shout out to our friends over at MindMed Australia. That if you've seen that commercial before, it was repurposed for our campaign. They allowed us to do that. So big thanks to them for helping us out with that. So again, the goal here is fairly straightforward. Create a licensing and regulatory framework to serve those who seek psilocybin therapy that could safely benefit from it, whether or not they have a pre-existing diagnosis. So a couple of bullet points on what our measure does. It will establish a regulatory framework within the Oregon Health Authority that will allow trained practitioners to administer psilocybin services at licensed centers. It will also establish an Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board that will be appointed by the governor, that will be made up of numerous individuals from doctors, researchers, therapists, mycologists, folks from different community stakeholders, BIPOC community leaders, et cetera, all to provide input and advice to the Oregon Health Authority within a 2-year rulemaking period that will commence after this passes in November. Again, there will not be any licenses available for 2 years. We really felt strongly about the need to go slow and be very intentional about rolling out this program, a first of its kind in the country. And I want to keep moving forward here. So just as importantly as what it does do, especially for our Oregon voters, it's important to let them know what this does not do. As a state that has adult use cannabis, it's very easy for people to fall into thinking that this is legalization for psilocybin. that is not the case. There will not be any retail sales of psilocybin allowed. There will be no off-site consumption or possession of psilocybin, nor will there be any branding or advertising, and it will be for folks 21 and over. So this is the psilocybin services modality, one that I'm sure many people who are familiar with the clinical research trials have seen before. The first step being a preparation session, as indicated in that video, where a client will meet with a licensed facilitator to do a health and risk assessment to ensure that they are mentally and physically fit and that they really understand what it is that they are proceeding into, and that they also have an opportunity to develop a relationship with the facilitator as well. The second step is the psilocybin therapy session itself, which again must occur at a service center, and the facilitator must be present throughout the entire process. And last, but of course not least, is the integration session, which must be offered by the facilitator after the completion of the psilocybin session. So diving into the campaign here, this is our campaign advisory board, not to be confused with the advisory board that will be created and appointed by the governor. There's probably some familiar faces here that you may recognize. Francois Sporzat, author of Consciousness Medicine, brings a great deal of experience in working with the Mazatecs down in Oaxaca that were mentioned here before, and really being able to help advise the campaign on ways in which we need to continue to ensure that we are centering and uplifting BIPOC communities and Indigenous communities as well in the ceremonial practices that have been involving psilocybin for thousands of years. We also have Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, head of the Psychedelic Research Imperial College of London, Marg Hayden, executive director of MAPS Canada, Pam Kriskow, who's a medical doctor, clinician, and of course, Paul Stamets here in the Pacific Northwest, a very famous mycologist who is continuously providing us insights and information on what the rulemaking period should entail in terms of the production of psilocybin as well. So here in Oregon, we're very lucky. We do not have any well-organized, well-funded opposition to our campaign. So it really is all about education. And so we know, based on a polling and focus groups that we have done here in Oregon, that when we are able to provide answers to these 5 questions, what is psilocybin? What does the research say? What does the measure do and what does it not do? And who stands to benefit from having access to psilocybin therapy? When we're able to provide just a little bit of information to Oregon voters, a majority of them are with us. Upwards of 55% of Oregonians are with us. We're actually getting ready to launch our first television ads this Tuesday. And we see that once we can get one 30-second television ad in front of people, support jumps to 55%. When they see a second 30-second ad, it jumps to 59%, and a third leaves them at 60%. So we very much know what we need to do in order to win this November. Again, this is a little bit of the math. We expect a little over 2 million votes to be cast. That means we need 50% plus 1. We start out with around just short of 900,000 votes, leaving us with a deficit of around 250,000 votes that we need to convert from no or undecided to yes. So some of our endorsements to date, this is family physician and state senator Elizabeth Steiner Hayward. She has been an incredible spokesperson for the campaign, being a mother, a physician, and a state senator who actually also happens to be the co-chair of our Ways and Means Committee in the legislature. So she carries a lot of influence and a lot of power, and we're incredibly grateful to have her involved in this campaign. Another clinician, Dr. Janice Knox, MD and MBA. In fact, her entire family, I think she has 3 daughters that are all medical doctors with MBAs. Quite an impressive family, if I do say so. She has been a clinician for over 40 years, and again, is just one of the examples of the folks that are really helping pave the path to help the average Oregonian, the soccer mom, the grandparent that had never heard of psilocybin, really get comfortable in that they can trust that these types of clinicians are behind this measure. It's also maybe a familiar face. Congressman Earl Blumenauer has been a progressive drug policy champion for longer than I've been alive, I'm pretty sure. And we are very grateful to have his support on the campaign. And of course, another mentionable is Dr. Nick Gideons, also a family physician, but more importantly in this context is a hospice medical director, as we've heard from Spencer and our good friends over at TheraSil. The angle of how psilocybin can help people who are suffering from end-of-life anxiety is incredibly important. And so we are sure to continue to include that messaging as we reach out to Oregon voters and educate them and explain the why they should support creating access to psilocybin therapy for people who are struggling with end-of-life anxiety. Here's some of the other endorsements that we've received to date that are worth mentioning: the ACLU, Cascades AIDS Project, the entire Democratic Party of Oregon, several other organizations, lots of veterans organizations. Heroic Hearts Project is actually working very closely with us to kind of pitch the veterans angle. Yeah, we're just very excited to have as much support as we have gained so far. The list goes on. We have over 150 licensed healthcare professionals throughout the state of Oregon, only some of which are listed here. There's also continuous other organizations worth mentioning. Some folks here may be familiar with Chakruna as well, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, etc. And really quickly, this is a 30-second ad that is very likely to be up on television in the next couple of weeks with one of our veterans who was recently featured on the front page of a major newspaper here in Oregon as well. Oh, and there's the newspaper, but let me see if I can play this.
I was a Navy SEAL, 18 years, 12 combat deployments. I took a medical retirement. I suffered depression, anxiety, trauma, injuries on the inside. I couldn't live life outside. Dark thoughts. I tried talk therapy. Doctors threw pills at me. Nothing worked. Psilocybin therapy? I don't have the words. It breaks patterns of negative thoughts. You gain this awareness about yourself and it sticks. Yes on 109 means a new life without suffering.
So this is the front page article that Chad was on again. Pretty powerful story in terms of being a Navy SEAL for 18 years with 12 combat deployments. He came back with literally everything from addiction to suicidality to depression, anxiety, everything. He's told me personally that had it not been for psilocybin therapy, he does not feel that he would be alive today. And so that's certainly another story, again, that we are continuing to push out. The science and the facts combined with the personal stories of those who have benefited or that stand to benefit from having access to psilocybin therapy. That is what moves Oregon voters, and that's how we plan on putting a W on the board this November. And last but not least, another quick 30-second ad with our state senator and Dr. Elizabeth Steiner Hayward talking about the protections.
Measure 109 regulates a promising approach for depression and anxiety, psilocybin therapy, a medicine derived from mushrooms with access controlled. Measure 109's regulations require psilocybin only be used by adults in licensed clinics supervised by trained facilitators. It's not legal for recreation, it's not sold in stores. A 2-year phase-in to develop safety, practice, and training standards. Measure 109 promotes safety for a therapy that can help people who are suffering.
So that's the end of my presentation. The final thing that I'll say here that I appreciate Carlos mentioned as well is that there are numerous different models from the decriminalization to therapeutic focus to Portugal-style full legalization. And we are in support of all of those models. And the other thing I'll say is that there's nothing in our measure that prevents local decriminalization efforts from moving forward. They are absolutely compatible, and we are supportive. And I think, as others would attest in other areas too, in order for each of us to win in our own lane, we have to be very specific. And so that is what is reflected here in our measure, is a laser specific focus on the therapeutic model that we look to create here in Oregon that hopefully can stand to set the golden standard for other states to follow across the country. And so with that, I will go ahead and stop my screen share and hand it back over to Steve.
Hey, thanks for that. Are those commercials live yet on TV, or are they rolling out soon?
First commercial will go up on Tuesday. It's actually funded by the Heroic Hearts Project and highlights the research and things of that nature. And then we'll come in with vote yes ads from the campaign over the next couple of weeks. So, the other thing that I'll say is that I'm actually, unfortunately, not going to be able to stick around for Q&A, but I'm going to put my email in the chat box here. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. Anyone who's interested in getting involved, you can help us phone bank from any part of the country or the world. And so we've got our work cut out for us, and we really could use as much help as possible. So I'll definitely put my information here in the chat box. And thanks, everyone. And thanks to everyone here for having us. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. Take care. Okay, next up we have Dustin Robinson. Dustin is deeply involved in the cannabis industry through his law firm, Mr. Cannabis Law. He serves as the legal director for Normal of Palm Beach. He is the co-founder of MPL, a 501c4, which is Mr. Psychedelic Law, which is focused on using medical and spiritual research to drive responsible legal reform in Florida for psilocybin mushrooms and other entheogens. Dustin has drafted resolutions for psychedelic decriminalization for various cities in Florida and hopes to build a responsible legal framework in Florida for the commercialization of psilocybin mushrooms and other entheogens. He has built a team at Mr. Psychedelic Law that consists of the top lawyers, lobbyists, doctors, scientists, and spiritual leaders in the state. Dustin, it's all you, man.
Awesome. You guys able to see my screen?
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Dustin Robinson, co-founder of Mr. Psychedelic Law. First, I want to thank PsiloHealth as well as the entire Mr. Psychedelic Law team for helping put on this event, as well as all of our speakers. I mean, you all did an awesome job. What an amazing job all you guys did. I also want to thank our viewers. This movement is much bigger than all of us, and we all need to do our part in moving this forward. Your attendance today is really just a huge step in doing just that. So thank you to everyone involved in this event, and even thank you to the future viewers that will watch this on a recorded line. So I have a very short period of time, so I'm going to run through these slides very quickly, and I'm probably going to talk pretty quickly. So I've put my contact information at the bottom of each slide. So if anyone wants this presentation, just shoot me an email or give me a call or hit me up on IG or whatever. I'll send you the slides. Also happy to talk about any of these topics in more detail if you want to reach out to me. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because the other speakers have already gone through the history quite a bit, but it's really important to understand our history. You know, the key here is that in the 50s and the 60s, a few researchers were making tremendous discoveries with respect to the medicinal value of psychedelics. But in the 60s, the hippie counterculture and some other people started really experimenting with these substances more in a recreational, spiritual manner. And, you know, there were some bad situations that occurred and the government didn't like it. So essentially the government lumped psychedelics in with the war on drugs, which essentially stopped any further research. So really a lot of the research we're doing right now over the past several years is really just picking up on what we already really learned in the 50s and 60s. So it's very unfortunate that we kind of had this huge gap of time where we really weren't able to do this research, but it's exciting that now it's actually picking up. So the takeaway here from a legal reform perspective is that we need to be responsible on how we roll this out. In addition to learning the benefits of these substances, we also need to understand the risks involved so we can properly address those risks in our legislation. It's important we understand the difference between decriminalization and legalization. The speakers today were talking about, some were talking about decriminalization, some were talking about legalization. Very important to make that distinction. What we're seeing in cities like Denver, Oakland, and Santa Cruz is decriminalization at a city level. So decriminalization does not mean that you're allowed to sell and purchase these products. There's no commercial framework under a decriminalized model. It simply means that possession and use are the lowest priority for the city, and the city will not be allocating resources to prosecuting people over these substances. So very important to understand that when something is decriminalized, it doesn't necessarily mean it's legalized. We just heard Sam talk about the Oregon measure, which that is an example of a legalized model, right? It's actually a commercialized way where people could actually use these substances, and there could be a purchase and sale, of course, not retail sale of these substances, but you could actually use it under the care of a trained medical professional. So the path to decriminalization and legalization is long, and we saw it in the cannabis industry, and now in the psychedelic industry. Here I highlighted this first bullet point is really there's two things that are simultaneously occurring. So the first bullet point basically just it ignores federal law, right? This is where we have city decriminalization, and that's like I said, we're seeing in Denver, Oakland, and Santa Cruz. Next is state decriminalization. That's usually the order of operations. You'll see a city decriminalized, then that state will decriminalize. It then goes to a legalized medical framework, which many in the industry are calling the psychotherapeutic approach. And then it goes to recreational, spiritual, religious, which many in the industry are calling the entheogenic approach. So simultaneous with that, we are seeing significant progress at a federal level with respect to getting these substances approved through the FDA, which includes companies like Compass Pathway and USONA. We heard Dr. Scott Fisher talking a little bit about what he's doing with USONA. You also have groups focusing on federal descheduling. That's organizations like Mind Army, which is a nonprofit that I actually started with some other clients that is focused on federal descheduling. But just to be clear, federal descheduling, very highly unlikely that we'll have much progress with that. So the Mr. Psychedelic Law team is really more focused on this state initiative here in Florida than anything at a federal level. So we're really more focusing on this first bullet point here, starting off with city decriminalization. And later on, I'll show you some of the resolutions that we've drafted if we have enough time with respect to that city decriminalization. So the main thing here, we talked about one of the paths is the FDA pharmaceutical. The key here really is that the FDA has issued breakthrough therapy designation for psilocybin with treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. So the progress we've made from an FDA perspective in the psychedelic industry is just tremendous. In fact, it's even more so than the cannabis industry. So I know I talk, my law firm, we exclusively focus on the cannabis and psychedelic space. And oftentimes people kind of laugh that we're trying to do legal reform for psychedelics, but they don't realize that from an FDA perspective, psilocybin is probably looked at more fondly than even cannabis. So we're making incredible strides at an FDA level with respect to these products. So I want to talk about the psychotherapeutic approach. And it's very important that you kind of understand, sometimes I'm using these words loosely and I'm talking in generalities. Obviously, language is very important in this movement, but I'm going to kind of define these words in the own way as I understand them. But certainly these terms are very malleable and they could change tremendously. And there's certainly, to some extent, they mold together in a lot of ways. So the psychotherapeutic approach stems from the belief that the legal movement should focus on the medicinal value of these substances and should be administered by individuals that traditionally administer medicine. So this is really the medical approach. We saw in the cannabis industry where we have the medical cannabis framework and the recreational framework. Really, the medical approach really comes first, and that's really kind of what we're seeing with the psychotherapeutic approach. And it's important to understand that these approaches don't have to be independent of one another. So these approaches in many ways do come together. But it does look at, you're going to have qualifying conditions, you're going to have an older demographic, you're going to have a doctor-patient type of relationship when you're dealing with the psychotherapeutic approach. In contrast to the psychotherapeutic approach, there's the entheogenic approach, which mainly believes that the legal movement should focus on the spiritual and religious value of these substances, and any restriction on administering these substances would infringe on our fundamental rights to control our own mind and seek happiness. So the entheogenic approach is really more of an individual rights argument, and what they want is broader access than just people with qualifying conditions. They want it to be available to the masses, and in a lot of search situations, potentially, administered whether by shamans, healers, or even on your own volition. So very different schools of thought, but certainly both these schools of thought, I think, have a place as we work our way through the legal reform. I'm not going to get into the caregiver model because we don't have too much time. Location shapes the experience. Only thing I'll say at this slide is in the cannabis industry, set and setting really wasn't that important in the legal framework. For the most part, you're only allowed to smoke cannabis or have your cannabis administered in a private setting. Some states that have recreational allow it in certain public places, as long as those public places are licensed. But really in the psychedelic industry, the framework is really going to have to consider the set and setting, and the Oregon measure did a really good job of really addressing set and setting in their measure, and that's something we're going to have to take a really close look at as we kind of create the commercialized framework moving forward. Greed may not be good. While companies focus on generating revenue, there is less focus on consumer health and individual liberty. With that being said, I'm a capitalist, so I believe strongly that money does need to flow into this industry. We need to have people investing, but at the same time, we just need to strike the right balance and make sure that there is a focus on consumer health and individual liberties. So what's the Mr. Psychedelic Law mission? We want to use medical and spiritual research to drive responsible legal reform in Florida for psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelics. Just breaking apart this mission, if you look at the beginning part, it says to use medical and spiritual research. And that's why we've created a medical advisory board, and we also have a spiritual advisory board. And what my vision is that really those boards, as well as the community at large, is really going to drive the change. So we have a legal and a lobbying team as well, but really the legal and lobbying team are not the subject matter experts. So it's really our goal to take with our medical advisory board and look at the psychotherapeutic approach, and then the spiritual advisory board that is going to talk to us about the entheogenic approach, and really hear all sides and really engage with the community to hear where they think this should go, and then really create a framework depending on what city we're going into. So this is just the team that we have at Mr. Psychedelic Law. It's our medical advisory board. You've already heard from Dr. Michelle Weiner, Dr. Scott Fisher. We have Dr. Julia Meyer, who shout out to her. She did a huge job in putting this whole event together. We have a great spiritual advisory board, legal lobbying team. But what I also want to say is that we're working with a lot of organizations. We are not trying to take credit for any one initiative that we're doing. PsiloHealth has been tremendously helpful in doing some of the stuff we're doing. We are working with different groups in other states like silo.org. So we're really trying to create a structure where we can all support one another, which is very different than some of the other movements that you've seen. And it's pretty special when you see all these different psychedelic organizations all coming together and really not caring so much about getting credit, but more so just caring about getting the information out there, getting the education out there, and really moving this whole movement forward. It's just very exciting to be a part of it. So what's our approach? So back in January, we started going and talking to cities. We went to town hall meetings. This was pre-pandemic. Brought me, Dr. Scott Fisher, Dr. Weiner, Paula Sevchenko. We all went to these city commission meetings and we educated these city commissioners. And I will tell you, in Florida, we were very well received. They were all very interested. They all wanted to hear more. We had tremendous success at a lot of these cities. Unfortunately, once the pandemic hit, they kind of shifted some of their priorities, but we are still pushing them quite a bit, and we're trying to get more virtual meetings with them so that we can continue to push this movement forward. So our goal is to get 3 to 5 cities on board with decriminalization. Then we want to focus on decriminalization from a state perspective. And then we want to roll out a commercialized legal framework here in Florida. So now, some of you may be wondering, why don't we just go straight to a commercialized legal framework? Why don't we do something like what Oregon's doing with their measure? And the reason is that Oregon is a much different state than us. They're extremely liberal. They led the way in cannabis. They were one of the first states to legalize cannabis. And really, Florida, if anyone knows Tallahassee, they're not ready for psychedelics yet. I can tell you they are not ready, and I'm very doubtful that we'd have much success if we try to do a statewide constitutional amendment. So really what we need is to take baby steps, and that's why we're really starting at a city level, and we hope to get several cities on board. And then once we get those cities on board, we think that we could take this to the state and start really making progress at a state level. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to pull up actually a resolution that we've drafted for Hallandale. What's great is that so many of these organizations, we all work together. You'll see a lot of the language in here is from resolutions in other cities, and we plug and play. At the end of the day, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. So we've drafted several different iterations of different resolutions, and it really depends on the city that we're working with. But a couple of provisions I just want to point out that are in here. I talked a little bit before about the 2 main parts of decriminalization are basically not allocating resources to prosecuting people over these substances. So that's what Section B is. And the second one is just making it the lowest law enforcement priority, which that's what Section C is. It's basically just making it the lowest law enforcement priority in the city of Hallandale. Once again, that does not mean it's legal. It just means it's decriminalized. They're going to make it the lowest priority, and they're also not going to allocate resources to it. I also want to point out one other provision, Provision G, Provision G says that the city of Hallandale acknowledges that the use of entheogenic plants and fungi for health and spiritual well-being should be done in consultation with and under the supervision of trained medical professionals. The reason I want to talk about this provision, because this is a great example on why I want to engage with the community and I want to get feedback from the community. We're going to be doing way more events where we could actually have dialogue with you guys so that we could really get your input, get you guys involved in this movement. But with this particular provision, I have a few questions. Number one, should it even be in here? Do we really need it to be under the supervision of anyone? Number two, do we want it to call it trained medical professionals? Number three, do we want to define trained medical professionals? And number four, do we want some sort of certifying process for a trained medical professional? So these are all decisions that we want to be super inclusive with the community. We want this to be, we want to engage with you guys and we want to get your feedback. And there's a whole bunch of provisions, you know, that we've also drafted that certainly we need your feedback as well. So I just think this is a great example of really making sure that how we administer these products and what we allow within the city and what we eventually allow within the state really should be a part of a much broader dialogue to make sure we do this properly. I think that is pretty much all the time I have. But one thing I will say just for the end is just, if you want to get involved, what I recommend is going to mrpsychedeliclaw.com, click on get involved, fill out the information. I will make sure that we keep you up to date on all of our efforts and make sure we actually try to get some information from you guys and get you guys involved. So check out the website, click on get involved. Really appreciate all you guys attending, and I think we are now ready for our Q&A session.
Yep, I will be bringing on all the panelists. Give me one moment. Yeah, and everyone in the audience right now, again, we have that Q&A section of the Zoom panel at the very bottom. So please go ahead and just type away your questions. There's also a raise hand feature somewhere on the screen that you can utilize. We will be tracking that. So if you'd like to raise your hand, we can go ahead and unmute you. You can ask your question through audio as well. I also want to take this time right now to additionally thank Dr. Julia Meyer and Scott Fisher for their time and their energy and contributions toward orchestrating the event. It's been, you know, we couldn't do this without you guys and without any of the panelists here. So thank you guys so much, and let's have an awesome Q&A section. Cool. So one of the first questions we received was, is there any research on the public opinion of mushrooms in the 18th and 19th century Europe? Would Beethoven be open to eating these on the long walks? That was by Adam. Does anyone know about any of this? Any public opinion? I'm not familiar with anything.
No idea. Next question.
Okay.
Sorry, but yeah, I don't think we have any feedback on that one. I think that was kind of said in jest.
Next question is there any research on psilocybin and bipolar disorder? Maybe Scott Fisher can answer that one.
So far, there hasn't been a lot of research. There is a good way to know what trials are happening in terms of what's registered with the FDA is to go to clinicaltrials.gov. And if you go there, you can search for all the trials, you know, associated with psilocybin. There is one that they're starting to look at bipolar 2 disorder. It's kind of, you know, anecdotally, you know, so-called psychiatric patients with bipolar and schizophrenia, they were given, you know, psychedelics under the medical model, you know, in the 50s and 60s, and it didn't seem that helpful compared to some of the other conditions. So, you know, take that for what it's worth from our perspective, from the medical side of things. But I think it's a study that will be done at some point. They have been prioritizing these ones that have seemed, you know, end of life, you know, depression, anxiety, OCD, ones that sort of anecdotally have responded better to psilocybin. So That study will be done, but right now there's not a lot of good research.
And then just to add off to that, thanks, Scott. I posted a little article called Shroomin with Bipolar Disorder. I believe the authors of that article are anticipating a 2021 clinical trial to be conducted or study to be conducted through UCSF's laboratories. So that can also help with any insight you have in terms of looking for any research for psilocybin and bipolar disorder. All right, next question comes from Kristen Spear. She asks if anyone can comment on the main clinical differences or benefits on psilocybin or of psilocybin we might see as compared with current ketamine therapy, including Spravato.
So there have been no head-to-head studies done to my knowledge at this point. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov, there is one small study that I think is being planned to be done. Sort of anecdotally, ketamine is something that seems to give shorter-term relief and needs repeated sessions. The ketamine trials that were done at the NIMH in the 2000s, early 2000s, kind of showed the need to have a lot of repeat treatments. You can't compare that to the psilocybin trials that we've done, but in the psilocybin trials, it was much fewer treatments and much more durable response in terms of how long people felt well afterwards, you know, and some of the end of life and cancer patients, you know, up to 5 years later, people are still saying that treatment is still working for me now.
And just to make the legal distinction with respect to ketamine, a lot of people don't realize this, it's a Schedule III substance. So a lot of mental health practitioners are starting to use ketamine for various mental health conditions and as well as pain and for other reasons. So I know Dr. Michelle Weiner has done tremendous work with the ketamine. I'm working with various groups that are doing work with ketamine. So there is kind of this unique distinction where ketamine kind of falls outside of a lot of the other substances we're using that are actually Schedule I substances, which make them very hard to research and to provide. There's no off-label use because they're not FDA approved.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Shannon. Shannon asks, what's needed in general to be a trained, licensed psilocybin facilitator? Who would like to tackle that question?
Well, I could just say, I think Scott's probably best to answer that. I know he's gone through training, and there's various organizations out there right now that are offering different types of certification. So, you know, I think it depends on who you ask, you know, what type of certification you want to get. And I think as different cities and different states start putting together their legal framework, they may actually decide what type of certification from what organization should or might be required in order to satisfy those conditions. So I don't know, Scott, you want to give your experience going through your certification process?
Well, I mean, to deliver, you know, psilocybin as a medical treatment, I mean, we still don't even really have the framework for doing that because it is not an approved medical treatment as of yet. We can use as an analogy the MDMA-assisted therapy, which is being studied by MAPS. They have a specific sort of training program that you have to have, you know, some sort of, you know, credentials, whether it's, you know, a psychologist or a mental health counselor or physician to enroll in that training. So, but in terms of the psilocybin assisted therapies, there is no framework for it. Yeah, now there are training programs that are out there, and there are more and more popping up, and this is where you'll start to see there's so many different avenues that you might want to come at in terms of trying to train people. And I think the take-home point is there will be no one best way of doing it.
Carlos, do you have anything in your ordinance or what you're working on through in Oakland to regulate or to somewhat help certify any folks looking to facilitate citizens' experiences? Is there any verbiage there? You're muted right now, just so you know.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually we're contemplating that. I wanted, if I could just take a step back for a moment and give a little bit of clarity as I answer the question. Cannabis is still illegal at the federal level. And at the state levels, they're legal in certain states under certain frameworks. And at the local levels, they're legal under certain frameworks. So I want to just clarify that. And thank you, Dustin, for raising the issue of decriminalization versus legal. They're all illegal until we get them removed from Schedule 1. But at the local or state level, they can become legal with a legal framework. In Oakland, we're actually looking at a legal framework for community-based ceremony. Again, not as an alternative to clinical, not an alternative to Western medicine, but as a complementary community-based approach. As part of that, and working with Denver and working with Oregon and Washington in the future, what we're talking about doing is looking at that community-based framework of ceremony-based healing, which is highly accessible, and then layering on top of that the clinical approach, where then we can work with our state agencies to protect the licenses and certifications of medical professionals. So that's kind of coming down the pipe. And in fact, we're starting to have that conversation with Denver now in an alliance where we're working together to decriminalize and legalize and then protect service providers, at least at the state level. But again, at the federal level, it's even cannabis is still illegal. And I did want to answer the question. Yes, if it is dangerous to put in under Western medicine supervision in a resolution of decriminalization, because then it biases the elected officials towards the path of least resistance, which is the greatest risk reduction for them, which means all other cities will start adopting this sort of Western doctor supervision approach. And we're really trying to stay away from that. So I really appreciate you asking that, Dustin. We talked a lot about it and realized that once we open up that can of worms, every politician is going to say, oh, we'll put that in there. And next thing you know, we've lost our ability for self-agency. So really appreciate you asking that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Carlos. And just to add on to the whole legalization thing, one thing to be very clear, just like Carlos said, it's still federally illegal. And even in cities like Denver, they've had people arrested by the feds even since they passed their decriminalization efforts in Denver. And I get calls all the time from people I'm working with in Denver. We want to open retreats. We want to do a grow. We want to do all these things. And people are really looking to push the envelope. But it's very important people understand that even in Denver, where it's decriminalized, still federally illegal, still legal from a state perspective, and even still illegal from a city perspective. It's just pushed down as the lowest priority. So very important to keep that in mind for those of you that are interested in getting involved from a business perspective.
And if I may add to that, thank you. There's a big difference between law and power. The reason that the feds aren't no longer enforcing against cannabis is because there's so much power now behind the movement at the state level and the local level that if the feds were to begin to go after the states, which actually they've done in California where they subpoenaed records and the state legal teams are fighting the feds and how much they can actually access information. So we've now amassed enough power through legal resources, through money, through interests, that the feds aren't prosecuting cannabis. And the intention of the Decrim Nature movement is really to build that power at the local level and then the state levels, where until it's descheduled, we at least have enough power to push back.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Shannon, for that question. We'll move on to another question right now. Dustin, what cities in Florida are you currently focusing on?
I'm happy you asked. So we're really, since I'm located in Fort Lauderdale, which is South Florida, we are really focused on the South Florida cities, Hallandale, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, Miami Beach. But we'd love to expand this to other cities. There's really no reason that we can, especially since now a lot of these city meetings are virtual. In the beginning, we were physically attending these meetings. Now they're actually doing them virtually. So there's really no reason for us not to get more involved in other cities. I just happen to know, public officials in all the cities down here in South Florida. I don't know as many officials in Central and North Florida. But this is really where we engage with the public and the community. We are totally inclusive. If you want to get involved, if you want to go speak at your city commission meeting, I will support you. I'm sure Dr. Scott Fisher will support you, Dr. Michelle Weiner, Eric. I mean, we have a whole team to offer some support. So if there's any cities that you have in mind that you want to get involved, I recommend maybe, either reaching out to the commissioners or just attending a commission meeting. You may need to give them prior notice so that you're put on the agenda. but we can work with you through all that. But right now the focus is mainly South Florida.
Awesome. And that's a good segue to ask, so Nurse Debbie, Macaulay, Patricia, they're both asking, essentially, how can they get involved in expediting this legal process?
I would say go to MrPsychedelicLaw.com, click on get involved. You'll fill out the information and we will definitely get you involved. There is, a limitless amount of work that needs to get done in order for us to be successful. So I am more than happy to welcome anyone that wants to get involved. Let me know. I mean, I think the key part is really also understanding, where do you want to get involved? Some people want to get involved on the research side. Some want to get involved on the legal side. Some just want to educate. So, when you fill this form out, really, try to be as specific as possible how you want to contribute, what you want to get involved with, and I'll definitely get you incorporated into our efforts.
Great. Joseph asks, has a question for Dr. Weiner specifically. Dr. Weiner, how do you foresee integrating this medicine with a medical cannabis practice?
Okay, so thanks, Dr. Rosado. Good question. I would say right now, we're basically starting the model with ketamine. So I'm using ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in my practice for chronic pain, migraines, treatment-resistant depression, some end of life actually, but always with therapy. So I imagine that it's going to be different in the sense that psilocybin will have an actual specific indication where you would have to go into the therapist's office, kind of like what I was describing in these studies, where you're going into the doctor's office, they're preparing you for what's about to happen, and then you're working probably with a therapist for the most part. And so it's going to be different than ketamine, which is right now we're doing off-label. It's a very self-pay model, but I would assume that in the future, once things are FDA approved and they're through insurance, let's say, then we're able to do it, in the office with more supportive supervision and really monitoring the dose and follow up and therapy and things like that. I'm not sure if Scott has his own opinion on this and wants to share his opinion.
Sorry, in terms of offering?
In terms of what you think will happen once things are actually FDA approved.
And how care will
how
be
we would have
delivered?
it clinically, how it would be in a supervised environment.
Oh yeah, you'll definitely. I mean, right now the model is to always have 2 therapists present for all the preparation, dosing, and integration sessions. The most of the not everyone doing funding this research is in the not-for-profit sort of vein, but a lot of them are, and so there's a big emphasis on access to care, making sure not only this is covered by insurances and things like that, but that Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, will be covering it. So this is something that we're expecting third-party payers to be able to cover in terms of the cost. But all these things are still really very unknown at this point.
And also it's also going to be it's going to be determinative if it's through the FDA or through the state, right? So we kind of have 2 paths that I identified before. What Oregon's doing with their measure, they're just saying, we're ignoring the federal government. We're not going through any FDA stuff. We're just creating our own model, kind of like what cannabis did, just like Carlos just mentioned, where cannabis just says, we don't care about the federal government. We're going to do our own thing. So if Florida were to get that far and create a commercialized model, that model would pretty much define how things are going to happen. And that's what you see in the Oregon measure. Whereas if the FDA approvals come first, which quite honestly, it looks like they probably will, then you're going to see something like what Michelle and Dr. Scott Fisher are discussing. So I think a lot of it is determinative of which path moves faster.
Yes, if I may add on to that, I appreciate that very excellent analysis. And this is why the Denver, Oakland teams and with David Bronner in Oregon are contemplating multi-prong approach. So you do the medical, the clinical, and the community-based ceremony kind of together in collaboration. So all it would do then, the benefit of that approach is it opens up multiple modalities of access.
And what's the outlook on that looking like? Is that what you're speaking about in terms of that collaborative effort with the Oregon movement with Decrim Nature, and then the folks in Denver at SPORE? Is that what you're speaking to?
Yeah, in Oregon, the 109 is out of the gate first, and then Decrim Nature came afterwards. So what we're trying to encourage folks to do is lead with Decrim Nature, because that sort of sets the greatest access point for everybody to have their own relationship. But then recently we've been talking about doing them all together through collaborative efforts. We learned through Oregon that doing it as a coalition is better than working at odds. So in Denver and in California, we just recently hired a lobbying team in Oakland to take our initiative, our ordinance, to protect our ordinance statewide through the pilot program that would enable every city to opt into a community-based healing model. Denver is looking at different modalities, and so what we do is use Denver as an experiment of how we might approach community-based healing, clinical and medical all at once. But the conversations there are very early, but at least what's happening is it's creating a coalition now of advancing multiple modalities at one time. So the conversations have started happening, and I think there's a broad recognition it's a good way to do it.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And if anyone's interested in contributing or collaborating to those early steps, how can someone get involved? Whether they be an individual or an organization?
You go to SPORE, I believe it's spore.com or decriminalizenature.org, or reach out to local Decrim Nature teams in Portland, in Eugene, in Colorado, or in California. And it'll become a bigger conversation here in coming months.
Cool. Thanks for that. Exclusive insight. Okay. This question will be, I believe Scott might be the best to handle this one, being that, are there any studies using psilocybin with children less than 18 for emotional trauma?
No, those studies haven't been done yet. A lot of the so far, most of the trauma studies have been with MDMA and funded by MAPS. MAPS does intend to do at some point, and it was actually asked by the FDA to do a study in adolescents for MDMA-assisted therapy for adolescents with PTSD. So that will happen, and it's likely that at some point, teenagers there will be a trial for teenage depression or other sort of treatments for psilocybin. Whether kids younger than an adolescent will ever be treated with psilocybin, maybe that study will be done. I think that'll be a little bit lower priority than testing it in teens first.
Yeah, and I think, just from my own personal use of microdosing, I think that there could be uses with ADHD, and we know a lot of children suffer from ADHD, and they're taking all sorts of crazy pharmaceutical drugs to deal with that. So, I'm hopeful that down the line, there'll be additional studies for various conditions that children might have, and they just might be maybe in lower doses, which we really didn't talk too much about in this presentation. But there's so many different options and different things that happen depending on the dosage you actually take, whether it's a very small, very micro dose, or a little bit bigger of a dose, or an actual macro dose. You're going to get very different experiences under each of those doses.
Totally. And yeah, that being able to conduct that type of research, we're going to need a lot more work in the advocacy realm and the educational realm. We need to normalize, destigmatize these types of conversations. So, I really applaud a lot of the attendees of this event, again, the panelists, for doing this, because that's how we can really lay out as many options as possible for people that really need access to these medications. So thank you, guys. Another question that has come up from Will Lancaster is there a clear psychiatric testing model for PTSD treatment and psilocybin combined with MDMA? I don't have an answer to that question.
So far, there haven't been any studies, to combining different psychedelics in the same sort of treatment. Certainly, underground practitioners and anecdotal evidence, there's a lot of different models. So that might be explored someday, but that's probably years away from really getting careful study, I would say.
Yeah. I believe, is it MindMed is looking into the candy flipping, doing a study on candy flipping right now. I believe this LSD is that with MDMA as well? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so there's probably going to be, I imagine with the outlook we have, that there may be some investigation for what you asked, Will. Thanks for the question. Another question from Kristen is, do you know if any current studies are including suicidality or suicidal ideation as an endpoint, either independently or part of a combined depression endpoint?
No, I haven't seen any sort of study along those lines.
And Eric has to head out. Thank you, Eric. I'm not sure if you're still on right now. I think he head out. Yeah, he put his information to contact. If anyone has any questions for him, reach out to him. Myself or Dustin will be able to forward that question out. No problem. And then another question from Kristen to Dr. Weiner. For end-of-life patients on ketamine, are they hospice or primarily palliative care?
So the studies that were done were actually either cancer patients or end of life, but they weren't defined as having less than 6 months to live. So it seems more like palliative care for these studies that I reviewed.
Great. Okay, and I think our last question of the day is from Rodrigo Ferreira. He asks, what kind of patients would be advised to not use psychedelic treatment? So maybe Scott, you want to take this? I guess maybe start with, if you don't mind, starting maybe with like the traditional like psilocybin, LSD, like some of the tryptamine analogs, and then maybe work your way to some of the other compounds if you'd like.
I mean, it's a tricky question to answer, because what is being studied right now is what can it work for, and not so much who should not be given it. So from that sort of medical approach, we don't have a good answer to that. Now the studies that are being done have definitely contraindications, whether they're medical or psychiatric reasons. So in terms of who shouldn't take psychedelic therapy, well, we haven't even proven to the FDA yet that anyone should take it. And who shouldn't take it, that's so far we don't have anyone we say shouldn't take it, but when you also don't have anyone from the medical model who you say should take it, it's sort of a tricky question. But I think, again, someone asked about bipolar, there's a lot of excitement about using this for depression, anxiety, OCD, anorexia, substance use disorder, and the question. And actually, I should have mentioned, and I didn't yet, autism spectrum disorder. There's been some studies with MDMA, but the question will be, certain personality characteristics, psychotic disorders, certain types of bipolar 1 especially. Could there be risk in giving, a medicine like psilocybin or other psychedelics? That needs to be studied.
Yeah. And then just purely from like a drug-drug interaction perspective, depending on the compound, if it has, for example, with psilocybin, you folks might assume that there's a risk for serotonin syndrome in combination with an antidepressant, such as like Lexapro. However, that's actually not the case. But what is the case is the potential blunting of the psychedelic experience itself. So more often than not, we find that psychedelic users actually do not have that, profound mystical-like experience because they're on their antidepressant SSRI therapy. But then if you go to another psychedelic compound, such as ayahuasca, that has that monoamine oxidase inhibitor, in conjunction to its DMT like a compound, then you have a risk for hypertensive crises depending on the patient's medical or list of medications. So it's really important to also have, in addition to what Scott mentioned, also have that understanding of the patient's medical background in terms of what medications they're taking. So that way you can prevent any potential drug-drug interactions from really severely harming anyone looking to be healed from these compounds. So yeah, great question. And then lastly, I didn't see this one from Patricia. It's an opinion question asking, what are your opinions on the current medical model of synthetic psilocybin being pushed? I believe she's asking more or less, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but are you just asking that, what our thoughts are on synthetic psilocybin versus naturally occurring from full fruiting by psilocybe mushrooms? If that's the question, I'd love to definitely hear your guys' answers to that.
I mean, I'll just say that, a lot of the decrim efforts that I've seen have been focused on, entheogenic plants and fungi, so the naturally occurring. But what's important to understand, I know, a lot of people want to stay away from the synthetics and we want it all natural. But from an FDA perspective, they essentially need that quality control of ensuring that it is the defined amount that you're getting in every single dose. And really, that's why you see with the clinical trials getting done at from an FDA perspective.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt, but to add on to that, it isn't that I think most of us think synthetic psilocybin is a superior medicine to, say, psilocybin mushrooms. But we're trying to prove through the medical model that this can treat certain medical conditions, and so we have to kind of play by their rules, which includes having psilocybin of a certain purity. And right now that's being done synthetically. Now, do we think that that's better than psilocybin mushrooms for actually treating these things? No, not necessarily. And that's why, these others, like Carlos was saying, these other sort of avenues and models and modalities are so important in terms of, exploring ways of increasing access to getting these medicines to people who can benefit from them.
And if I may add, thank you. Definitely there is a role, an important role, because we live in a Western society, for medical research, clinical research. There's a research component in our ordinance that is more of observational studies and effects of doing community-based healing. And that's very important, but I think what probably most therapists would tell you, and doctors too, I think if you have sincere conversations with them, is that the taking of the psilocybin or taking of the psychedelic plants or psilocybin mushrooms is really just the start of the expansion of the opportunity to heal. After that, it's the work, it's assessing your relationships, it's assessing your job, your housing situation, your community, what you're immersed in. The healing comes from that analysis. And so the danger in the Western approach only is that it, again, makes us believe that healing can come through a capsule or a bottle as opposed to looking at your entirety of your conditions that you're living in. And that forces us as a society to really look at what we're producing in terms of experiences for human beings through our economic and political models, which really is the benefit of doing the community up approach. But agree 100% that we need the Western science data. We used it to pass our resolutions. The science was absolutely critical for us to even open the conversation, scientific research. So they sort of have to coexist. And in fact, the society that we build together is incumbent on all of us figuring out how to work all these things together.
Well said. Additionally, I want to just say, Marcia added to all of our points, saying that, when it's with FDA approved plant medicine, it would provide that consistency in dosages. That's definitely the goal. So you can have a nice understanding as to what the effects of an FDA approved compound would look like. Well, thanks for adding that, Marcia. Thinking about comparing the synthetic, psilocybin compared to full fruiting body, psilocybe, cubensis, for example, there's still a lot more we need to understand, I believe. I think that one thing that'd be amazing to have would be is a head-to-head study comparing, users using a full fruiting body mushroom experience with the same preparation and integration surrounding the experience with someone using a synthetic psilocybin, with CGMP standards. Like that would be amazing to see and then observe. There's just so many things we don't understand when it comes to the entourage effect with magic mushrooms. Additionally, there's so many different compounds and other alkaloids within the full fruiting body that we still need to understand, and we are understanding more and more. So we have to just wait for more research to come out to really have a definitive decision on one or the other. But one thing that is for sure is that when it comes to access, I really think that that's tied in with fruiting body. If you can grow mushrooms out of a shoebox, then that's as accessible as it gets. Whereas when it comes to accessing synthetically created psilocybin, I mean, that's not going to be as affordable, unfortunately. That may not be as accessible, and so those are just some things that take in consideration. But with that, I'll leave it open for maybe 30 more seconds for any additional questions, and we'll happily take those. And if not, then we will hop off.
I think we're to the end.
Okay, I think that's it. Much love to everyone. Thank you everyone for hopping in. Stay tuned for more events like this in the future. Carlos, thank you for staying to the very end. Thank you all to all the panelists that hopped on, attendees. I mean, we're excited. We need to have a conversation like this, and the fact that a majority of you stuck on till the very end to hear it all out, and this is what it's all about. So let's co-create the future together. Definitely excited to hear about the upcoming news with Decrim Nature and that coalition in Oregon and Denver. Hopefully PsiloHealth can be a contributor to that energy. Scott, thank you for being the psychiatrist to answer all those questions that I wasn't too sure if I should be able to answer. So thank you for that. Dustin, thank you for helping co-sponsor this event with Mr. Psychedelic Law. And thank you to the PsiloHealth team, all of our attendees. Again, much love, and have a great night, everyone.
Have a good one, guys. Thank you.
See ya.